introduce Professor Margaret Knapp, Professor Emerita Margaret Knapp, Emerita from ASU, from the Herberger School, now Institute of Theater, Dance, and Film. I also want to tell you that Professor Margaret Knapp, first of all, she happens to be an extremely fun human being, an intelligent person with very interesting insights about Shakespeare and theater in general, and more than that, theater's place in society. And she's also a very modest person, because I only recently learned, she does not make a big deal about this, but I think this is quite a big deal, that she was the first woman elected as president of the American Society for Theater Research. Yes! It's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's okay. I think they can hear me without that. And to completely blow you away on that, that was as late as 1997. There had been no female president, so here we go. Professor Margaret Knapp is going to speak to you about a fascinating subject, which is how Shakespeare basically went through different avatars from high culture to low culture, what we call high and low culture, and the influence of Shakespeare on American culture in ways that you might not consider only purely intellectual. It's a very interesting talk that I think will span the gamut from what we call pop culture to the snootiest level of intellectual culture, because Shakespeare himself, of course, combined the two. And I think what will be particularly interesting for you, everything will be interesting for you in Professor Margaret Knapp's talk, but one thing I have to tell you I found particularly interesting in talking to her about this talk, I think you'll find it fascinating to see how she traces the evolution of Shakespeare's image as well in American advertising. Now that's something absolutely fascinating, because, you know, her title, which is Why Shakespeare, has us begin to ask this question. Why is it that he is still relevant to us, and relevant to the point that Madison Avenue can make something out of Shakespeare? So you're going to have a wonderful time at this talk, and before we begin, I just want to, as I always do, I have to thank my colleague Kendra Turbik, who started this whole series. Thank you, Kendra. Again, yeah. Give another hand. And I also do want to point out to you that we have two very interesting upcoming events. If you look at our table there in the back where you have water and cookies, please pick out. Very interesting event on Bibles, a magnificent biblical collection from the Malikian family. And we're going to be dealing with the history of Sephardic Spanish Jews and their connection with the Bible as it travels from Israel to Spain to India. And then we have a fascinating seminar on slavery, which is going to be held in two places. One on the Tempe campus on the 27th, and on the 20th on the West campus. So wherever you live, you have a place to get to it. And it deals with the dark side of the Renaissance. Well, Margaret's also going to deal in part with the dark side of the Renaissance and the modern period. I am very, very happy to bring you Professor Margaret Knapp.
I hardly recognized myself.
You're there.
And thank all of you for being here, and a special thank you to Changing Hands, my second home, because I live around the corner from here. And I've spent a good deal of my money on Shakespeare toys here, and have actually donated some of those to the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., which is obviously far too serious because it didn't seem to have a toy collection, and I thought they needed one. So, okay, let's get started here. Did we miss one here? Oh, all right. The first one just said, why Shakespeare? So, carry on. The subtitle here is, How Did the English Poet Become an American Icon? And the question seems to me to be one for us to ask from time to time, not as a prelude to excluding Shakespeare and his work from our current American interests and institutions, but to remind ourselves of how and why Shakespeare continues to occupy such a central place in our culture. This is obviously an enormous subject, and so tonight I want merely to present a few ideas about how we might think about Shakespeare in and of America. Now, let me begin by exploring the notion of an icon. Most of us are familiar with the word icon in connection with those cute little pictures on the desktops of our computers. And those images capture the nature of what an icon is, a person or object that symbolizes or represents something beyond itself. So we know that when we click on the picture of a trash can, we are getting rid of files or email we no longer wish to preserve. We recognize the icon's function because it relates to something familiar to us from our own lives, an actual trash can. A computer icon works through a fairly simple one-to-one correspondence between the picture and the function it represents. But other kinds of icons operate in far more complex ways, sometimes affecting different viewers differently or conjuring up different ideas and emotions within a single viewer. Icons can thus be efficient ways of communicating to viewers as long as those images are easily recognizable by those who are exposed to them, and as long as the viewer receives the image in roughly the way that the creator of the image intended. The Statue of Liberty is one of the most American of icons, standing in New York Harbor for over 130 years as a symbol of America's promise of freedom and safety to uncounted millions of immigrants. In 1903, a plaque bearing Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, was installed in the base of the statue, and its evocation of "you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free" must have inspired those Americans anxious to help assimilate the millions of immigrants passing the statue on the way to entering the United States. In more recent years, the statue has become a more generalized, less sacred symbol of America, suitable for a license plate. This is an old New Yorkie. Or for advertising. Other icons seem to attract deeper, more emotional responses as the years pass. Originally the battle flag of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, this icon was widely adopted by veterans groups and commemorative organizations as the Confederate flag. Today, its meaning and use is hotly contested, as we can see from the various struggles to keep it to have it removed from state houses and other public institutions. To some Southerners, it is a reminder of what has become known as the lost cause, a romanticized image of antebellum life best known to most of us from the novel and film Gone with the Wind. To others, it is a symbol of a racist strain in American culture that still exists to this day. Because it is a site of contestation, Confederate flag is obviously not a candidate for commercial exploitation because there is no general consensus about what it represents. Now that we've looked at how some icons work, we can look at Shakespeare as an icon in American culture. To begin with, Shakespeare's iconic status exists on a level and to an extent far beyond either his own life story or the sum total of his plays and poems. When we say the name Shakespeare, we summon up a visual image and also the total of all the things we've been told about him, good or bad, and what we've experienced for ourselves. Because almost no one graduates from an American high school without reading and maybe even performing at least one Shakespeare play, Shakespeare's image is recognized by a very wide segment of the population. Again, to be sure, no two people who see an image of Shakespeare or hear his name mentioned will have exactly the same reaction. But in fact, our ideas about him may change significantly over the course of time. Nevertheless, there is a common denominator of meaning, however vague, that we share when the icon Shakespeare is presented to us. And because of that, Shakespeare, like other major cultural icons, can serve a variety of purposes. To see how this works in a seemingly simple and direct way, let's look at some samples of print advertising from across the 20th century. As we look at these ads, think about whom the ads were aimed at. So who is the audience demographic, as we would say today? And what assumptions about Shakespeare the ad conveys? This first one is from the early part of the 20th century. So the world's greatest writers, Shakespeare and Waterman's ideal fountain pen. So here's an assumption that Shakespeare is the world's greatest writer. No ifs, ands, or buts. No qualification of in the English-speaking world or anything like that. He's just the world's greatest writer. It also appears in some ways to be an indirect endorsement that Shakespeare would have used the Waterman's pen if he lived today instead of that silly quill that he actually probably did use. I left the top on this ad because it's from the Youth's Companion in 1905, and it's an ad for Horlick's malted milk running down the side. And it has a picture of a young man carrying a mandolin, I think it's a mandolin, at a soda fountain with a young woman. And it says on the bottom, third, and then the lover with his ballad. And that's part of the speech, The 7 Ages of Man, coming from As You Like It. So the assumption here is that maybe the assumption that you need to know some Shakespeare to know what the ad is about. And then over here you can read about the pure, rich milk and the extract of choice malted grain. If you don't know what Horlicks is, and you still can get this, and it's available, the English particularly like it. It's sort of like Ovaltine, if you remember Ovaltine. And if you don't remember Horlicks or Ovaltine, you probably wouldn't want to try it. Take my word for it. Okay. This is a part of a series called Juvenile Shakespeare. Juvenile Shakespeare series. And it's like a little baby Romeo and Juliet. Aw, aren't they cute? You want to say, go back, don't get any older. Come out badly. Good night on the bottom, Juliet, good night, parting is such sweet sorrow. And the function of this, I think, is a picture, it's a kind of an ad giveaway, because you can send away for the full series of 4 if you send some stamps to them. So I assume people would have collected these, maybe put them in scrapbooks. What fascinated me most about this is on the back, it tells you about the medication. And you can see at the bottom, it's for headaches, constipation, sluggish liver, backache, pain in shoulder, dizziness, biliousness, heartburn, pimples and boils. So there's almost nothing that you can have that this will take care of. 36 pills for 25 cents. Just like drugs cost today, right? This is a and strangely enough, this ad has the most actual content about Shakespeare of any of the ads I looked at. And it's hard to, you can't read it really on the side, but it describes him and his life. And just, personally, this is just part of it. Personally, he was a handsome, well-shaped man of a merry temperament, abounding in energy and overflowing with health. How did they know that? His favorite eating place in London was the celebrated Falcon Tavern. I don't know about that. Here men like Ben Jonson, Marlowe, Ford, Fletcher, Herrick, Raleigh, etc. met him daily. These literary giants of the heroic Elizabethan age were in the habit of discussing the burning topics of their time, which included the colonization of America, over foaming tankards of beer. So the connection then is Shakespeare drank beer, so basically we should all do it. And it seems to have given him good health. So.
So are they trying to claim that their beer is the same?
No, they're just saying that Shakespeare went to the tavern and drank beer, so you should go to a tavern and drink beer too. Pointing at the screen. This is the most complicated of the ads. It comes from around 1950. And look at the elements in it. Towards the rear, on the bottom, are a pair of opera-length gloves. Some of us remember those. There's also opera glasses, a kind of handkerchief or scarf, a beautiful bud vase with a rose in it, and then some other kind of strangely related or unrelated materials. A picture of Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, and a newspaper clipping about the All-America football team. And then, of course, the Coca-Cola bottle, the complete works of William Shakespeare, and then the silhouette of a woman drinking a Coca-Cola. And obviously she has one to spare in this. So who's the audience for this? Who does Coke want to sell to?
Young men.
Hmm?
Well, college or young adults.
College or college-educated people?
Yeah.
What else?
Middle class.
Middle class or upper middle. Yeah.
Women.
Women. Exactly. So I'm speculating about this. It seemed to me it could be that during World War II, Coca-Cola probably donated tons of Coke to soldiers. And now they're perhaps trying to expand their popularity beyond men to women. So making it part of all of these delicate feminine objects. It's quite an interesting ad to take in. You know, it really does have a lot going for it. This ad, if you look at the word running sideways up at the top, is the name of the magazine that it appeared in. Does anybody see that? Playboy. So Gordon's Gin, which is a British gin, is advertising in an American men's magazine, Playboy, and connecting itself to the great icon of British culture, Shakespeare. And I think this, and here's another similar ad of theirs. What will the English think of next? Shakespeare's works, The Mini Dress, and Gordon's Gin. Also from Playboy. So it seems as if the emphasis is on Gordon's as an English gin, and obviously using, particularly in this one, the female figure in the mini dress as a kind of Twiggy-esque young woman, as an appeal to the Playboy readership. Not to be outdone by the British, the American Seagram Company, which had started in Canada but is now an American, has a balcony scene. And it says, "But soft, see what amber light through yonder bottle shines." And then farther down in the copy it says, "Come, gentle wife, join me. Let us lift our glass and then away to the theater to see how mere players do enact this scene." So, suggesting a pre-theater drink. I hope they're not driving after this. And this very strange setup, if it's a husband and wife, why they're on these two separate pieces of the building, it's a little hard to figure out. And she's wearing kind of typical 60s, well-dressed lady with beehive hairdo outfits. So in this case, again, connecting with Shakespeare as Gordon's did, but suggesting who their audience is, who they're trying to appeal to. We wouldn't have it any other way, would we? So you have two different paraphrases of Shakespeare. To milk or not to milk, that is the question, and all the world's a milk. And what's interesting to me about this ad is that this is an enormous advertising campaign, right? It's been going on for years and years, and just about every celebrity you can think of has had the mustache painted on in their pictures. And so it seems like they're trying to drag Shakespeare into our contemporary cult or interest in celebrity culture, that everybody can be famous for 15 minutes, but in this case, I mean, in a 5 years, if we looked at most of the ads for this campaign, we might not even be able to identify the people. But Shakespeare being in it is like the ringer, you know, the person whose identity will remain known.
And you don't have to pay any royalties either.
Exactly. I was going to get to that point. That's a very good point. You don't have to, you know, hire George Clooney at an astronomical rate. You can just use Shakespeare's picture for free. So I'm sure that entered into it too. This is a rather odd ad. Penguin Publishing Company, for many decades, published paperback Shakespeare. And all of us had them in school at one time or another. Now they're going into the ebook business, something really new. And so to kind of take the edge off of something scary and new, they created the headphones that you would need to listen to an ebook out of Shakespeare. So we're not really going completely off into the new world where we still have Shakespeare. So those are some ways in which Shakespeare's been used in ads. And to generalize about the use, it seems like he was chosen to appeal to middle to upper class viewers in many of the ads, right? You could see that. The viewers must recognize Shakespeare and maybe even bits of his plays. He seems to represent value, tradition, and Anglo-American culture. Also, there seems to be, at least in the Budweiser ad, a nostalgia for simpler times. The kind of feeling that might lead people today to attend the Renaissance Fair in Apache Junction in the spring, especially if they have a yearning for turkey legs. Finally, Shakespeare is depicted as in some way endorsing these products, although that claim is not made directly for obvious reasons, like Shakespeare being dead for 399 years. But as I said, and this listener pointed out, using Shakespeare to endorse your product is a lot cheaper than hiring an A-list celebrity. Earlier I stated that our personal images of Shakespeare are created from what we've been told about him and what we have experienced ourselves. To some extent, then, each of us has a different response when we see a Shakespeare icon. But our responses are also, to a great extent, being created and recreated by American institutions and individuals to serve a variety of cultural and commercial purposes. So the next question to ask is, what use is Shakespeare? Beyond being a widely recognized and cheap symbol for advertisers to exploit, what other ways has the Shakespeare icon been employed in American culture? One way to begin answering that question is to step back and look at a historical moment when Shakespeare was in the forefront of Americans' minds. The 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, celebrated throughout the United States in 1916. And this event was called the Tricentenary, which means 300th anniversary. Of all the forms that the Shakespeare Tricentenary took in 1916 America, the one event that has received significant scholarly attention is Percy Mackay's community masque called Caliban by the Yellow Sands. This is the program, Caliban. Caliban is a character in Shakespeare's The Tempest, who's kind of half human and half animal. And I'll get back to why Mackay used that character. This was performed at Lewiston Stadium in New York City, which is huge and outdoor, by a cast of hundreds of amateurs from all over New York City, plus such noted professionals as the actor John Drew, who is the uncle of Lionel Ethel and John Barrymore, and the dancer Isadora Duncan. The scholarly focus today is not surprising given Caliban's New York City performance venue, the fact that the script, along with illustrations and performance information, was published in advance of the performance, so you could buy this thick book that had the whole script in it, which was probably pretty handy because you wouldn't have heard anything in Lewiston Stadium. And it's still available in libraries today, and I've bought one copy at a library book sale, and this one I bought, I think, online from eBay. And that a steady stream of articles about the masque, written by Mackay and others, appeared in many easily retrievable publications of the time. Although Caliban has been studied so extensively, it has most often been examined in isolation, as if it were the only American instance of a tricentenary commemoration. Caliban, although indeed a major undertaking, was but one, and one type, of a massive quantity of American celebratory activity. So I'm going to try to fill in the picture a bit by discussing a few of the many other ways that the event was celebrated. Here's a case of a pageant done at Harrisonburg State, which I think was the former name of James Madison University in Virginia. Just look at the number of people involved in this. And this picture goes on. So everybody, probably everybody in the university or college was dragged out, and plus some children to play various roles. And here's a program from Illinois State Normal University, which did a, I have a fan there? All right. So now it's Illinois State, right? It's not the normal. Just like ASU is not the normal school anymore, except in the minds of people from U of A. But this is a beautiful cover for their Shakespeare pageant for the tricentenary. And it has a kind of almost like an Arthur Rackham quality to the illustration. As might be expected, the anniversary was observed at schools and colleges, libraries, and museums. But celebratory events also took place in churches, department stores, symphony halls, women's clubs, settlement houses, playgrounds, and even a Wall Street brokerage house, which had a little theater built into it. All across the United States, there were Shakespeare concerts, recitals, and lectures. City fathers and other notables unveiled statues and memorial tablets, or toasted the bard at lavish banquets. Students competed in Shakespeare oratory contests. Preachers extolled the Christian philosophy to be found in Shakespeare's plays. Artists designed commemorative book plaques. That was another contest. Society weddings were planned around Elizabethan themes. The American Museum of Natural History in New York opened an exhibit of Shakespeare's birds. As we've seen, some advertisers tied Shakespeare to their products, like Waterman's pen. And many publications jumped on the bandwagon, as did the New York Times, with 10 weeks of Shakespeare supplements in their Sunday rotogravure sections. So every week for 10 weeks they had a whole section about Shakespeare. Thank you, Barbara. And then there were the masks and pageants. There were large-scale community pageants in New York City, Baltimore, St. Louis, South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Columbia, South Carolina. And there were far more modest pageants and dances by immigrant school children on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and by members of the settlement houses in several cities. According to one estimate, in New York alone, 1 million of the city's 5 million people took part directly in at least one of the city's 1,500 celebratory events. And that figure could probably have been matched, at least proportionately, in many other American communities. A report by the Drama League of America listed hundreds of tricentenary activities planned for cities and towns in 47 of the 48 states. Only Nevada is missing, or Arizona is in there, as well as Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. No American who attended a public or private school, read a newspaper or magazine, entered a library, joined a settlement house, or shopped in a major department store would have been left unaware of the anniversary. Not even in the time of Queen Elizabeth I have so many Elizabethan cultural productions been available at one time. And this is just a couple more. This is the Morse School of Expression, which is a place that would train you in elocution, I guess. And they actually were doing a play, they were doing a production of As You Like It. And this is from the University of Pennsylvania, a production of Comedy of Errors. The reasons why there were so many American tricentenary activities are complex and sometimes obscure, but there are two that seem to merit consideration. the cultural work that Shakespeare, the author of the plays and the larger iconic figure, could perform for early 20th century America, and the remarkable web of interrelated organizations, mostly founded and run by middle-class white women, that made the planning and performance of a nationwide Shakespeare festival possible. Of the hundreds of public assessments of Shakespeare's greatness, from church sermons to public speeches to magazine advertisements, the majority support one of two largely unreconcilable views. Yes? Hello? The first one is Shakespeare as the ultimate symbol of Anglo-Saxon cultural superiority. And the other is Shakespeare as an instrument for the accomplishment of progressive social and cultural goals, from acculturation of America's rapidly expanding immigrant population to reducing crime among adolescents. The first view, often espoused by so-called nativists, alarmed at the specter of a watered-down Anglo-American gene pool caused by intermarriage with inferior Southern and Eastern European immigrants, allowed those who were obsessed with the immigrant problem to bask in the, sound familiar? To bask in the material proof of their racial superiority, the genius of Shakespeare. Nativists tended to hold their celebrations in private clubs or the private rooms of restaurants, where Shakespeare could be honored as one of us, the superior product of a superior race. But the year 1916 could also be considered the high water mark of what might be labeled a progressive Shakespeare. The term progressivism in American history refers to a related series of ideas and activities whose purpose was to improve social, political, economic, and educational conditions for Americans, both native-born and immigrant. According to historian David M. Kennedy, what he calls the progressive temper, or what we call maybe a mindset, included, quote, a faith in democracy, a concern for morality and justice, an exuberant belief in progress, a susceptibility to the revelations of journalistic truths. This is the age of the muckrakers. And the efficacy of education, a middle class and urban outlook, a quest for efficiency, and an entrepreneurial strain. Progressive men and women, mostly white and middle class, believed that they had the knowledge and power to improve American society in all of its facets. They were the driving forces between political reform in dozens of cities and towns. They lived and worked in settlement houses in poor neighborhoods. They lobbied for pure food and drug laws. They organized to build public libraries, museums, and parks. And above all, they crusaded for improvements in the educational system. Indeed, the progressives had an almost mystical belief in the power of education to ameliorate social ills. If they could only teach mothers to keep food from spoiling, fathers to be educated and conscientious voters, and children to participate in constructive school and leisure activities, the progressives believed that they could create a better America. And for progressives, education was also the tool through which the stream of new immigrants could be assimilated into a pre-existing American social structure. The extensive public tercentenary celebrations of 1916 were mostly shaped by progressive individuals and groups who saw the occasion as an opportunity to lead large numbers of Americans in events that would not only celebrate the centrality of Shakespeare to American culture, but cause masses of the population to literally embody progressive ideals by performing in pageants, masques, dance, recitals, and a myriad of other activities. The tercentenary was in some ways a proving ground of progressive educational theories, particularly the rejection of passive memorization in favor of learning by doing activities. And this is part of the philosophy of John Dewey and others, progressive educators. Producing a pageant, a masque, or scene from Shakespeare's plays meant engaging school children in acting, writing, making costumes and scenery, learning Elizabethan dances and comportment, and a host of other exercises that would not only teach them about Shakespeare's life, times, and work, but would actually enable them to experience through their bodies and their imaginations a sanitized and idealized Elizabethan milieu. In addition to activities in school, progressive educators were instrumental in creating and expanding the playground movement, through which they believed they could improve children's physical condition and offer constructive uses for leisure time. This is from a book called The Playground, 1916. The ideology of the playground movement in the early years of the century eschewed what we would call free play in favor of highly organized and even regimented activities, as you can see in the picture. Playground leaders across the country could thus work out an elaborate Elizabethan or Shakespearean celebration that would require weeks of rehearsal and other creative activity, knowing that they would have large groups of children to assign to various predetermined tasks. The leaders of the settlement houses, which also provided constructive leisure, as they called it, for their clients, made similar use of the tricentenary as an occasion to teach immigrants a progressive version of Anglo-American values, history, literature, and behavior. Some progressive educators and writers believed that dramatic activity was also a constructive way for adult Americans to use their leisure time. The apostle of community drama, as it was called, as a way of engaging adults in imaginative communal activity that would prepare them for positive participation in American social and political life, was Percy Mackay, the author of the Mass Caliban by the Yellow Sands. In a series of books and essays, Mackay argued for a new kind of performance activity in which average citizens could participate. His ideas coincided with and in turn influenced two progressive concerns. Number one, how to help workers to overcome the stultifying effects of soulless industrial work, the kind of boring, repetitive jobs that many people were having at this point. And also how to help workers find constructive uses for their increasing leisure time, a result of labor unions' successful struggles for a shorter work week. There were some people who were extremely afraid of workers having too much leisure time and what might result from that. The former problem about the soulless repetitive activity had been articulated by William Morris and the members of the arts and crafts movement in Great Britain, which also had many adherents in America. The American magazine Craftsman published several articles about pageants, and this is one from 1909. The value of outdoor plays to America. Through the pageant shall we develop a drama of democracy. And notice who the editor of the Craftsman is, Gustav Stickley. So if you've heard of Stickley furniture, which if you had some today, you would be very wealthy indeed, and went bankrupt in 1916, edited and published this journal, The Craftsman, which saw pageants as the equivalent of the arts and crafts movement. For Mackay and others, the answer to mindless, repetitive industrial work was not mindless, passive attendance at a commercial theater, but active participation in the creation and performance of outdoor pageants and masks. The pageantry movement had reached its height in America around the time of the tricentenary, and was therefore a popular form for celebrating Shakespeare, especially since the Elizabethan period was constructed by Mackay and others as an ideal pre-industrial world where workers benefited directly from their own labor and spent their leisure time in jolly dances on the village green. This is a picture of some children. I bought this on eBay, and the worst thing about getting something on eBay is there's no context. It just says Shakespearean Festival on the back of the picture. But you can see from the costumes that they were attempting some sort of Isadora Duncan-esque dance. And it may actually be a maypole in the back. The pageantry movement, we did all that, right? Yes, okay. Mackay differentiated between pageants, which were usually organized around a story, and many of the pageants done in Great Britain and the United States depicted the history of a specific area. So a town or city would have its pageant giving its history. And masks, which Mackay called his Caliban a mask, which were organized around an idea. His Caliban is a complicated series of episodes involving the civilizing of Caliban, the coarse and animal-like slave of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, the play that, if you were here at the last session, Sharona refused to even name, much less discuss. But The Tempest was huge during the tercentenary because it seemingly refers to America. Ultimately, Mackay's Masque celebrates Shakespeare and, above all, the power of the theater to civilize and educate the people of the world. And remember, 1916 is just before mass culture. There's no radio. Film is just becoming long form with Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. And so live theater and vaudeville are the main kind of mass entertainments that exist at this point. Ostensibly a community creation, pageants and masks were often written and directed by a professional pageant master, as they were known, and several of them were women, who was in a position to articulate his or her own ideology through the Book of the Words, as the pageant script was called. Isn't that pretentious, the Book of the Words? While participants did not make decisions about content, at least for the major public pageants, some may have made creative contributions in areas such as scenery, costumes, and staging. The majority of pageant participants would, however, have carefully assigned roles, often consisting of marching silently across the playing space, dressed as characters from Shakespeare's plays, members of Elizabeth's court, famous writers and artists, or other worshippers at the Shakespearean altar. One of the most widely shared characteristics of the tercentenary celebrations was that they were performances about Shakespeare, his work, and his world, rather than performances of his work. I can suggest a number of reasons why this would be so. Children and adult amateur performers were not up to the demands of memorizing and playing a major role in a Shakespeare play. Also, Shakespeare's bawdy jokes and sexual references would not have been deemed appropriate for children or adults to perform. Outdoor audiences would hear what was being said only intermittently and could easily be distracted from the performance. Shakespeare's more undemocratic ideas, such as criticism of the common people or approval of the institution of monarchy, could be avoided. And pageants were flexible and could accommodate hundreds and even thousands of performers. One of the organizations that contributed to the pageant movement was the American Pageant Association. And they would issue bulletins once a month or so on this kind of blue onion skin paper with red printing. So, and there are many of these in the Thomas Wood Stevens collection at the University of Arizona, which I went to explore the time that the Super Bowl was being played at ASU's stadium, and it was a good time to get out of town. You can't read all, these are all pageants that have been reported that are coming up. And the little X's on the side that I put in are the ones that are about Shakespeare. So every month during this period, you would see a whole bunch of Shakespeare pageants being listed. Where am I? As an art form that presented a carefully controlled message while seeming to offer opportunities for creative self-expression to large numbers of participants, pageantry was an effective means for progressives to educate both American and foreign-born children and adults in the traditions and values of Anglo-American culture. Although some progressives believed in the melting pot idea of a total assimilation of Anglo-American and immigrant cultures and traditions into a new American superculture, most progressives devoted their efforts to acculturating immigrants and children into what they perceived as a pre-existing and predominant culture. For the middle class, relatively well-educated progressives then, celebrating Shakespeare was both a means to educate their inferiors and an opportunity to display their own acculturation into an American tradition that had never totally severed its ties with the mother country. A desire to commemorate Shakespeare, no matter how widespread in 1916 America, would not by itself have led to the remarkable number of celebrations that actually took place. What made the nationwide celebrations possible was an interrelated network of nonprofit associations that already had in place substantial national organizational structures and communication systems. The leading role in organizing the Tricentenary was taken by the Drama League of America. Organized in 1910 by a group of well-to-do women in Evanston, Illinois, which was also the headquarters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who initially gathered to read plays on their maid's day off, the Drama League began with the aim to improve the artistic and moral quality of the American commercial theater. According to one of their publications, the League's general aims were, and this is a quote, to crowd out poor plays by supporting and commending good ones, and building up audiences for them through study classes, reading circles, dramatic organizations, and lectures, to aid in the restoration of the drama to its honorable place as the most intimate, most comprehensive, most democratic medium for the self-expression of the people. Oh, those were the days. Don't you love that? At its founding, the Drama League drew on 63 existing drama societies with about 10,000 members. 5 years later, in 1915, it had 100,000 members. The League stirred up considerable national interest in the drama through reading circles and bulletins that assisted local clubs in choosing which touring plays were worth seeing or which scripts the clubs might read and discuss, sort of like Oprah Winfrey. These activities gave the Drama League a great deal of influence over both the commercial theater and the thousands of local drama clubs. Eventually, the League began issuing a steady stream of information about how the clubs might produce plays themselves. In addition to the bulletins, the League organized a lecture bureau, summer institutes, an annual convention, play contests, a newsletter, and specialized bureaus to handle such problems as proper historical clothing, sending out dress patterns, sewing samples, etc. They also published a distinguished journal called The Drama. The phenomenal growth of the Drama League in both size and range of activities can only be understood in the context of the important role that women's clubs played in late 19th and early 20th century America. Although early 19th century gender ideology insisted that women remain in the domestic sphere, that is, middle-class white women who did not have to support themselves through work, women began to forsake the isolation of a homebound existence for associations with other women in such activities as making bandages, clothing, and other necessities for soldiers in the Civil War. After the war, women began to join together in clubs that were dedicated to a number of purposes. Some were church-related, while others were dedicated to the temperance movement and were allied with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the first national organization to give a prominent role to women. Many clubs were devoted to self-improvement through study of literature, art, or history. While some clubs brought in outside lecturers, most club members believed in teaching themselves. In the literary clubs that were especially popular, individual women would take on the task of learning about and explaining to the other members a work of literature, such as a Shakespeare play. Many clubs remained small enough to meet in a member's home, but in some urban areas, clubs grew so large that they developed what they called departments, or separate interest groups, that might pursue anything from literary study to political reforms. Lacking access to many of the literary works they wished to study, women's clubs founded 75% of the local public libraries in existence today. Some clubs took up the cause of what they called civic housekeeping, a kind of euphemism for involvement in political and social reform. Working from the premise that the job of women was to run an efficient and moral household, members of some clubs extended their sphere of activity to cleaning up the corruption and inefficiencies in their local governments. And of course, as the 20th century dawned, many clubs took up the cause of women's suffrage. Having successfully developed its own organization as well as its connections with the larger network of women's clubs, the Drama League was ready to take on its biggest challenge, the Shakespeare Tricentenary. Announced at the League's 1914 National Convention, the plans called for celebrations across the United States with a special Tricentenary Bureau at the League's headquarters in Chicago. There's a pamphlet Suggestions for school and college celebrations of the tricentenary of Shakespeare's death in 1916. And that's just one of many, many kinds of pamphlets they put out. Progress reports were given in the League's newsletter and in the drama. Bulletins and pamphlets gave tips on how to learn about Elizabethan music and dance. This is one put out by the Drama League of America Cleveland Center about Shakespeare's songs, so that any group that wanted to do a musical presentation could make use of it. They recommended reworking existing occasions such as commencements, fairs, and annual performances of dramatic clubs into Shakespeare celebrations. Advocated the planting of trees and gardens and guided those interested to information sources, and described the kinds of school competitions that could be established, offering to provide an excellent little monograph on the subject. The League's endless ideas and information about celebrating the tricentenary and its relentless efforts to keep the commemoration in the forefront of America's attention, even as events in Europe were becoming harder for Americans to ignore, were the product of a cadre of Shakespeare scholars and educators, supplemented by talented publicists. But it was the highly developed administrative skills and organizational connections of a large number of experienced club women that ultimately guided most of the hundreds of tricentenary events to fruition. If the tricentenary provided an occasion for nativists and progressives to construct a Shakespeare that fit their ideologies, it was ultimately made possible in its countless local forms by the work of experienced and inexhaustible club women. Despite the extensive nature of the American celebrations and what they may have meant to the people who organized, performed, and observed them, the tricentenary has largely disappeared from American collective memory. As the war in Europe increasingly occupied the public discourse of Americans, the tricentenary understandably began to fade from view. What is less understandable is why it has almost completely disappeared from both the public consciousness and from scholarly research and writing about Shakespeare in America, with the exception of Caliban by the Yellow Sands, as noted above. One reason may be the almost complete demise of progressivism in America. The progressives' first wave of success, culminating in the nomination of Theodore Roosevelt for his second term as president on the progressive or bull moose ticket, was followed by Roosevelt's defeat and the ensuing administration of Woodrow Wilson, who was a less consistent supporter of progressive policy. More importantly, Americans' experience in the Great War created a less optimistic, more cynical view of the perfectibility of human beings. Dreams of creating a melting pot, or at least successfully acculturating new immigrants into Anglo-American culture, were destroyed by the so-called Red Scares and subsequent reactionary immigration policy of the 1920s. While Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s embodied many of the progressives' ideals and policies, there was strong opposition to much of his legislation in his own day, and an obsession with dismantling the New Deal in subsequent conservative administrations and Congresses. Perhaps the only trace of the progressive ethos that can still be discerned is the seemingly the imperishable American belief in the power of education to transform people's lives. And so it should not be surprising that if traces of the progressive Shakespeare still exist in America, they exist in the textbooks, lesson plans, and examinations of American schools. Why Shakespeare? Although our collective memory of the tricentenary may have faded, the sheer number and ubiquity of the celebratory events meant that Americans of the time could scarcely have avoided hearing about Shakespeare. The messages of Shakespeare the genius, the author of timeless tales about what it means to be human, clothed in beautiful language and depicted through unforgettable characters and actions, must have made their way into the minds and hearts of 1916 Americans. From there, it is likely that schools and colleges, literary clubs, and theater companies adopted similar views about the work, often ignoring the knotty political, social, and psychological issues that the plays and poems raise. Given enough time and resources, I think it would be possible to follow Shakespeare's role in American culture for the next 99 years up to our own day and discover that we too are the inheritors of the tricentenary's views about Shakespeare. views that allow us to see him, like Superman, as an avatar of truth, justice, and the American way. Clearly, the advertising world sees him that way. Until that research can be done, we have only to look around this wonderful bookstore to see how shoppers, myself among them, are eager to buy and display images of Shakespeare in everything from dashboard bobbleheads to automobile air fresheners. The iconic Shakespeare is alive and well right here in Tempe, Arizona. Thank you.